My scariest Thanksgiving dinner. Growing up, my family never had a great Thanksgiving. For us, those fateful Thursdays in November weren't times of reunions and lavish dinners. They were times of sadness. Just another lonely holiday for the Birch family. Then again, we never had a chance. My mother died during childbirth when she had me. I honestly believe my father Sam always resented me for it. Somehow, I think his warped mind even blamed me. We all lived in Colquitt, Georgia. It was a quiet little town. There was just me, Daddy, and my older brother Brandon. Brandon was 3 years older than me and, like myself, was also a pale ginger. We were equally scrawny and vulnerable. My family was middle class, but it certainly didn't feel like it. After all, Dad hardly ever spent time with me and Brandon. He never complimented us, never encouraged us. Every night, Dad would get home from the mill well after 10. He'd spend those extra hours not working overtime, but downing beer over at Moby Dick's Bar and Grill. At just 10 years old, Brandon did all he could to take care of me. But we were young. Our suppers were nothing more than whatever frozen TV dinners we could find. But we still bonded. We'd watch cartoons together and play board games. He'd even help me with my homework. Brandon was mature for his age. Ultimately, he became the parent neither one of us ever had. When we were together, the house became our sanctuary from Daddy and the outside world. We also had all those framed pictures of Mama hanging on the walls. They made us feel safe, like she was always watching over us. But in these circumstances, we didn't have a chance. Kids couldn't watch kids. With no mother and essentially no father, the Birch family was destined to end in tragedy. Especially once Daddy came home. That's when our imaginary playland turned into a real-life horror. Sam was an abusive alcoholic. By the time he got home, his buzz would have turned into a bitter rage. And the brunt of his anger went toward Brandon. Not because Daddy didn't want to hurt me, but because Brandon made sure he didn't. He stood up to Sam. Along with his maturity, Brandon protected me with the passion of a caring mother. On those horrible, long nights, Daddy would take Brandon to the bedroom with him. I'd be left there on the couch, alone in our dark living room, trapped in this modest house that always felt darker and colder than it ever should have been. I looked toward Mama's pictures for support, for comfort. But with her gone, she couldn't console me. Only Brandon could. Maybe I was too young to suffer from Daddy's wrath. But unfortunately for Brandon, he was old enough to understand our abuse and mistreatment. And he was old enough to endure it. I never asked Brandon what went on behind those closed doors. But even as a child, I had a sinking feeling that I didn't want to know. During one of Daddy's drunken Thanksgiving, Brandon had finally had enough. Daddy had forced me out of the kitchen and made me watch TV. He told me to just focus on Scooby-Doo. Don't worry about him or Brandon. And whatever I did, don't go in the kitchen. He told me Brandon was gonna be punished for being a bad boy. Just thinking of those words now sends chills down my spine, not to mention they were the last words Daddy ever said to me. To this day, I still don't know how it all went down. I have no idea how my 10-year-old red-headed brother grabbed the knife and stabbed Sam over 15 times in the face and neck. Or why Brandon was found naked, caught red-handed holding that bloodied knife. His nude body was covered in so much blood that his hair had turned into an even darker red. In the kitchen, the police found Daddy's slaughtered, naked corpse desecrated beyond belief. Daddy with his penis severed. His ass was shredded to pieces. Needless to say, our TV dinner feast had gone untouched. With so much blood on it, our food looked like it had been covered in a thick crimson sauce. And I was right where I was told I needed to be. In the living room. My young eyes were glued to the Scooby-Doo marathon. I had been too scared to dare peep into the kitchen. And looking back, maybe I saved myself from further trauma by doing so. They took Brandon away, and I was sent to live with my mom's sister in Tallahassee. I should have been there all along. Aunt Sue had a gorgeous home. And unlike Dad, she wasn't a miserable alcoholic. She had life and compassion. And she cared about me. Not to mention she celebrated holidays. She made them fun. And yes, those Thanksgiving with her were glorious. The polar opposite of the hell Sam had put Brandon and I through. My years with Aunt Sue became the soothing shelter from the stifling storm that was life with Sam. She helped me through everything. She was there for me for my graduation from FSU and my marriage to Randy. She was there for me when I went from being Victoria Birch to Victoria Flowers, lead paralegal at Radica Inc. I was successful, yeah. But I wouldn't have made it this far without Aunt Sue. I wouldn't have become this confident or ambitious. I wouldn't have met Randy. I wouldn't have my handsome 6-year-old son Lee or beautiful 3-year-old daughter Ann. I wouldn't have my life as it is now. I'd gone from being a mistreated little girl in Colquitt, Georgia, to a pretty and wealthy upper-middle-class mother in Florida's state capital. A path that'd make the Hallmark movie company drool. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't have made it this far without Brandon. Both with his support growing up, and with the way he freed us through brutal violence. Over the years, I did my best to reach out to Brandon. I'd go see him in Jacksonville when I could. He'd even call me sometimes. But our conversations were always stilted and awkward. Nothing organic like it was when we were kids. Then again, I suppose that's normal. Nonetheless, I still loved him. And I knew he was getting the best treatment he could. I made damn sure of that. From what I understood, he was doing pretty well. The doctors just said he suffered outbursts and fits of rage from time to time due to the trauma Sam had inflicted upon him. But overall, he was doing much better. One of these days, I figured Brandon would come back to see me when his mind was clear. When he was ready to leave Jacksonville Mental Health Center. Then we'd be a happy family again. And for the first time in his life, he'd get to celebrate all those holidays with me. For now, I had this year's Thanksgiving to worry about. I always made sure we Flowers did it big. Countless decorations, and an excellent home-cooked dinner. Pilgrim and turkey figurines are everywhere. Pumpkins on the front porch. Lee's Thanksgiving-themed school crafts are stuck on our fridge. This was gonna be a holiday Lee and could always look back on with fondness. I suppose I had extra motivation due to my miserable upbringing with Sam. My festive motivation about the only nice thing that asshole ever passed on to me. That and the red hair, I guess. On Thanksgiving morning, me and End were cooking in the kitchen. I'd been prepping since around 7 a.m. Like a band getting ready for a sellout crowd. Only this crowd was so much more important, my family. As in, me, Randy, and the kids. Yeah, there'd be no in-laws or anything like that coming over. But the stress was still all too real. The Flowers family Thanksgiving had to be a success. If I was a freak about it, so be it. It was Thanksgiving, goddammit. I had the food arranged on the long counter. The dressing, the corn, the beans. And yes, a huge uncooked turkey. At 3 years old, and was little more than a cheerleader for me, albeit an adorable one. She had Randy's dark hair and my attitude. A baby fat that didn't keep her from looking any less cute. Like many of our items in this new house, I had plenty of great appliances to aid me in this festive feast. Besides, I liked having Aunt as my right-hand man anyway. This was the same type of kitchen bonding Aunt Sue and I had done all those years. Pushing through the swinging doors leading into the dining room, Randy and Lee entered the kitchen. Randy was dressed in a thin jacket and shorts. I couldn't blame him since this would be yet another warm Thanksgiving. With those cheekbones and combed over hair though, he was rocking a classy DILF look. Then again, he was a paralegal like me. He knew how to rock that professional yet smoking hot appearance. But behind the superficial shit, he was still so caring and understanding. He'd even gone with me to visit Brandon a few times. "Hey, how it's going, babe?" he asked. "We're on track for noon," I said. "Just in time for kickoff." We exchanged a quick kiss. I looked over to see Lee and Aunt staring at all the food in wonderment. Like they were at Disney World all over again. Hell, the turkey hadn't even been cooked yet and they were already drooling. Then again, the damn thing looked to be the size of them. Jesus, was I cooking a pterodactyl? Just a few more hours, I told them. Lee looked at me with his bright eyes. He had my ginger hair. And yes, Randy's laid-back demeanor. "Can we have some candy?" "Yeah," and shouted. Grinning, Randy rubbed Lee's hair. "Let's get that pumpkin pie first." "Yay, pumpkin pie!" and yelled. Overexcited, she ran laps around the kitchen. Thank God, I hadn't given her candy yet. "Okay," Lee said to Randy. "You're just going to the gas station, right?" I asked my husband. Randy smiled. "Yeah, I'll be quick." He kissed me. "I love you." As he turned toward Lee, I snuck in a quick slap on Randy's firm ass. I couldn't resist. "I love you too," I told him. I leaned down and kissed Lee on the head. "I'll have dinner ready soon, okay?" "The turkey too?" he asked. "I promise." Full of joy, he kissed my cheek. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too." Wrapping his arm around Lee, Randy led him off toward the living room. "Bye, baby," Randy said to me. "Okay," I said. I saw and run into one of Randy's legs during her frenetic jog. I couldn't help but smile. Chuckling, Randy kissed and before letting her continue, and picked up right where she left off. Her mouth was the roaring engine. Her feet the ferocious tires. The kitchen is her racetrack. Thanksgiving morning, you can't beat it. Until Christmas, that is. 30 minutes later, I had the turkey in the oven. I was now off kitchen patrol. Together in the living room, and I watched the Scooby-Doo marathon. A hallway loomed right behind us, as did a flawless staircase. The show didn't resurrect any traumatic memories for me. Given how clean my house was and how huge our flat screen was compared to Sam's bulky piece of shit, the comparisons between the past and now ended with a cartoon dog. My life was in a new place. And Anne's early years were gonna be reflective of how Aunt Sue raised me. Not how my dirtbag father did. As instead enraptured by Scoob and the gang, I kept checking my phone. Randy wasn't replying to my texts. Restless, I looked over at the nearby front door. I was hoping to see Lee and Randy stagger in at any second, but they never did. Anne's laughter drew my attention back to her. I stood up off the couch and caressed her shoulder. I'm gonna go check the turkey. Just wait right here. And like an addict, Anne's eyes stayed glued to the screen. Okay. Her hand rummaged through the bag of Dum Dum lollipops lying at her side. She wasn't going anywhere. Clutching my phone, I walked into the kitchen. The turkey was still cooking to perfection. I got ready to call Randy and see what was taking him so long. Right before I could mash the call button, a steady knock distracted me. Startled, I looked toward the doorway leading into the living room. More knocking from the front door echoed toward me. Someone's at the door, Mommy. I heard and yelled. I'll get it, I replied. As another knock rapped on the wooden door, I walked through the living room. Right past and Scooby-Doo. Stopping near the door, I looked out a window. I saw our driveway. The eloquent neighborhood runs right behind it. But on my front porch stood a man I hadn't seen in months. A man I hadn't seen on Thanksgiving Day in over 20 years. Brandon. His frame was more slender than ever. His hair was redder than ever. In all those years, he still looked the same, just taller. Handsome but haggard by all the stress of an abusive father and a long stay in a mental hospital. But still, he looked nice, even in his ragged jean jacket and ugly khakis. I could tell he was fidgeting not from our non-existent cool weather, but from understandable nerves. He was avoiding eye contact with the door and windows, as if he could tell I was looking right at him. Who is that, Mommy? I heard and asked. Caught off guard, I looked back at her. Just someone Mommy knows. My eyes drifted back to the front door. At first, I hesitated. Then I realized this would be our first holiday together. I mean, this was my older brother's home for the holidays. His next calm knock startled me from my thoughts and worries. My emotions won the internal debate. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Outside, Brandon greeted me with an awkward smile. But he wasn't forcing it like he did at Jacksonville. There was bittersweet emotion in his expression. Hey, sis, Brandon said in his typical dry tone. Oh my God, I said. Smiling, I gave him a big hug. Gentle, he hugged me back. Awkward as always. How are you? God, I don't believe it. I leaned back and just looked at his grin. His bright eyes. Brandon Birch was here in the flesh. Back with me. And fuck, he was skinnier than ever. Like a skeleton with a red wig. When'd you get out? Like a gawky teenager, Brandon shrugged his shoulders. Yesterday. They said I was good to go. His smile grew even wider. So I figured, why not come here and see you on Thanksgiving? It's a Thanksgiving miracle, I teased. Brandon chuckled. Struggling with my conflicted emotions, I paused for a moment. Listen, Brandon, I'm sorry I didn't see you last month. Brandon gave a dismissive wave. No. I understand. I got busy with the kids. The Coke and case. With a soft touch, Brandon caressed my shoulder. It's okay, sis. He smiled. You've got your own life to worry about. I understand. Thanks. Taking a step back, Brandon motioned toward the neighborhood. But I'm sorry for dropping by like this. No, it's fine. If you want me to go, I can, Brandon said. Aunt Sue said she'd take care of me. Chuckling, I grabbed his arm. No, that's ridiculous. It's Thanksgiving, man. You sure? Yes. Emphatic, I led Brandon inside. Come on. We've got plenty of food. Sweet. Inside, Brandon was awestruck by the picture-perfect house. With the hospital walls and doctors removed, our bond felt stronger than ever. Like we were children again. We joked and reminisced. Maybe having Scooby-Doo on helped. Brandon and hit it off as well. She even gave him a dum-dum. Brandon hadn't lost his ability to relate to children. Even when Dad took his innocence, no one could ever take away Brandon's youthful spirit. We left and back in the living room. In her Scooby-Doo vortex. In the kitchen, Brandon and I managed to catch up on old times. Aside from the occasional stutter or restless tics, Brandon looked comfortable. The most comfortable I'd ever seen him. I think he was more excited than anything to have Thanksgiving dinner with us. It'd be the first time he'd ever have a feast with people he loved, he told me. Given how well Brandon and Randy got along, I knew Randy wouldn't mind. Shit, the way Brandon helped me prepare the food, I wouldn't mind if Brandon stayed here for a few more months. Nothing like a little extra help around the house. Working together, we placed all the plates and silverware on the dining room table. Yeah, I'd help them with the food sometimes, Brandon said about his stay in Jacksonville. Oh? I said. Yeah. He straightened out one of the plates. His perfectionist tendencies would probably never go away, I figured. Obsessive tendencies. I never wanted to eat it though, Brandon said with a smile. It was nothing like this. I ain't ever smelled food that smelled this good. I chuckled. Well, you know how Aunt Sue is. I like to think she taught me well. Oh, for sure. With careful precision, he laid down the last knife. He nodded toward the kitchen. I couldn't help but notice that turkey though. He's fucking huge. Grinning, I put down another bowl. I got the biggest one I could find. Man, Brandon exclaimed. That's like one of them Christmas Carol turkeys. Laughing, I started to lead him back toward the kitchen. I always wanted to have one of those. Brandon added. In the kitchen, Brandon walked over to the oven. This is what I always wanted, you know. Amused, I watched him steal another peek at the turkey. He was worse than the kids. Or Hangry Randy for that matter. A Thanksgiving with just me and you, Randy went on. He closed the oven lid and grinned at me. Like the dinner we should have always had. I nodded. I know. Uneasy, I watched Brandon stop right in front of me. Lost in my reflections, I struggled to get my words out. I'm sorry, I finally said. I'm sorry about what happened. About Dad. My eyes looked to the floor. Calm, Brandon ran his hand along my arm. Hey, sis. I looked into his bright eyes. We're here now. All right. That's all that matters. Yeah. Fighting off the melancholy, I looked over at the food. They were the delicious delicacies that neither Brandon ever got to enjoy in our youth. Such luxury Brandon hadn't experienced his entire life. Let's enjoy the now, sis. Brandon caressed my cheek, making me look at his warm smile. Like an avalanche, my nostalgia swept over me. I love you, I said to Brandon. Without hesitation, I hugged him. A genuine, heartfelt hug. I could feel Brandon's arms frozen in place, but I didn't care. I figured he was confused, not used to the affection. I love you too, I heard him say in a dry mumble. That monotone he'd had since childhood. As if my love had melted his stoic awkwardness, I felt Brandon's hands collide against my back, completing our warm embrace. I'm just glad you're home, I said to him. He squeezed my back. A little tighter than I expected. I am too, he muttered. His grip only tightened, but I could still breathe. But I couldn't break free of his grasp even if I wanted to. This is our Thanksgiving, sis, Brandon mumbled. His voice was drier than a bored juvenile delinquent's. Regardless of his odd behavior, I didn't panic. He was my brother, after all. Mama! And yelled from the living room. Like he was struck by a taser, Brandon let go and took a startled step back. Playing off the weird encounter, I looked toward the doorway. Are you okay, Ann? Come here, Mama. And called to me. I better go see, I said to Brandon. He let out a nervous chuckle. I faced him. You want to watch TV with us? With compulsive ferocity, he shrugged me off. Nah. He looked at all the food. I can just watch the turkey if you want. I gave him a confused look. You sure? Yeah, positive. Like a confident top chef, he walked over toward the oven. I'll take care of everything. Mom. And hollered in her most obnoxious pleading voice yet. Like a sugar-fueled kid, you'd hear screaming in the audience for a children's show. That's my girl. Pulled away by Ann's demands, I stumbled toward the living room. All right, thank you, Brandon. Brandon leaned in toward the oven. No problem. Mama, come here. And yelled. I'm coming. I responded. There was no emergency in the living room. Just a concerned 3-year-old who'd forgotten her mama was less than 50 feet away. I comforted Ann on the couch. With a little help from Scooby-Doo and Candy, of course. We watched a few episodes of the marathon. All the while, I kept hearing movement in the kitchen. I figured Brandon was fine. I gave him a holler here and there, but he kept responding he was okay. Maybe I was being naive, but I trusted him. Fuck it, I was kinda tired too. I'd been doing Thanksgiving shit all month long. Randy never helped much in the kitchen. Needless to say, the kids didn't either. I guess it was kinda nice having an assistant chef for once. Even one who'd just been released from a mental hospital. I texted Randy, "Where are you?" A few minutes went by and I still hadn't gotten a reply. Trying to calm my lingering anxiety, I looked over at Ann. Her eyes were all on the cartoon. A lollipop in her small hand. Not a care in the world on her face. I was never that tranquil at her age. That innocent. Brandon and I never were. Dinner's ready. Brandon yelled from the kitchen. Like his voice was the snap of a hypnotist's fingers, and leaped off the couch and ran toward the kitchen. So excited she left Scooby and the dum-dums all behind. Chuckling, I followed after her. That was quick. Yeah, I heard Brandon say. My phone vibrated. Propelled by hope, I stopped and checked it. The unsaved number dashed my hopes quicker than that queasy feeling you get when you drink too much. All I could tell was it was a Florida number. But I knew it wasn't Randy. Dejected, I rejected the call. Were telemarketers calling on Thanksgiving now? You ready? I heard Brandon tease in. Yeah. And squealed with enthusiasm. Nervous, I looked over at the TV. The game was about to start at any second. As was dinner. Wouldn't Randy have called by now if he was running late? Or at least respond to my texts? Victoria. Brandon said from the kitchen. Mommy. And shouted with glee. Their chorus drew me away from the living room. a temporary distraction for my restless unease. I entered the kitchen and walked past the closed oven. The dining room was set up perfectly. There was all the dressing and veggies, the mashed potatoes, sweet tea, and positioned like a shrine at the center of the table was the large turkey. Brandon had done a great job. Impressed, I stared at the meal. Wow. Brandon pulled out a chair for me, one right next to Ann. Thank you, I said. No problem, sis, he replied as I took my seat. I looked over at Ann's wide grin. She was so cute and ready to eat. A few feet away from us, Brandon sat at one end of the table. So hopefully, the turkey's done, he said. Grinning, I looked at the turkey. Somehow, it looked even bigger than I remembered. Did it grow while in the oven? Of course, the gravy only made it look all the more appetizing. Yeah, I'd say so. My phone buzzed, startling me from the salivating sights. I left it in there a little longer than you wanted, Brandon said. I checked my phone. A voicemail from that same number awaited me. If it was Randy, he would have just texted me, I figured. He knew I didn't answer weird numbers. One of the tricks I learned back at the hospital, Brandon went on. In a state of confused silence, I faced him. Like he was the therapist, Brandon gave me a worried look. What's wrong, Victoria? Nothing, I said in an unconvincing tone. Even Ann was looking right at me. I saw the confusion in her young eyes. Are you gonna eat, Mama? I didn't even answer my daughter. My eyes drifted over to all the food. Here it was Thanksgiving. A holiday I'd been prepping for. A holiday that was gonna be enshrined in the Flowers family memory banks forever. And yet I felt weird. Uncomfortable. Brandon was here. But everything was so incomplete without Randy and Lee. Are you okay? Brandon asked me, concerned. Doing my best to downplay my unease, I looked over at Brandon. Yeah, I'm fine. I just haven't heard anything from Randy. Oh, I'm sure he's fine. But they've been gone all morning. Nonchalant, Brandon slid a bowl of mashed potatoes over toward the excited Ann. Maybe he's gonna surprise you. Maybe. I contemplated the idea. I suppose Lee may have talked him into getting a Christmas tree. Like she was digging into treasure and started dumping the potatoes all over her plate. Trying to reassure me, Brandon flashed me a smile. After all, it's Thanksgiving. I forced a smirk. Yeah, you were probably right. I slid my phone back into my pocket. The food distracted my gaze for the time being. I'm sure Randy and Lee wouldn't object to me partaking in the meal without them. After all, Brandon was here. The three of us began eating. And never complained. Not that she had time since she was shoveling so much food down her mouth. I tried to get her to slow down, but Brandon convinced me to not worry about it. Just let her enjoy it, he'd joke. Thanksgiving only comes once a year. Brandon had a point. Maybe I should just fucking relax and enjoy the food. At some point, Lee and Randy would come dragging their asses in. Then together, all of us would enjoy the night. Our first Thanksgiving with Brandon, my family finally reunited. Soon enough, we moved on to the turkey. I was gonna let Brandon have the honor of cutting it and taking the first piece. After all, he'd worked pretty hard setting the table and making sure the bird didn't explode in the oven. But he insisted I do it. The turkey was tough to cut into. After a few hard slices, I finally managed to get a couple of large cuts. And it was delicious. The best turkey I'd ever had, in fact. For all the shit this meat gets, and rightfully so, I'd never had it any juicier or tastier. Sure, the sauce and dressing helped. But the meat wasn't dry. The turkey had a natural flavor. An exotic tinge of something else. The whole thing was like really soft steak. With eager delight, both Brandon and dug into their cuts. "You like it?" Brandon asked me. Judging by his shit-eating grin, I knew he'd seen how much I was enjoying it. I must have looked like a kid eating their first chocolate bar. All the gravy on my face was like smeared chocolate. I swallowed a piece. It's excellent. Good, Brandon said. He took another bite. He damn sure chewed it with relish. Delicious. Enjoying the good mood, I exchanged smiles within. With the sudden gesture of a spoon tapping a wine glass, I heard Brandon throw his silverware onto his plate. The shrill screeching noise made me and look right at him. "Such a great dinner," Brandon said to me, his dry tone sounding more sardonic than chill. He locked his bright eyes with me. "It's a shame we never got to have these with Dad." Suspicious, I kept my gaze on him. Brandon's smile was sly, and just as calculating as his tone. "I know," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw and grabbed another piece of turkey. "Of course, we know the real reason why," Brandon said. A cold smirk crossed his lips. "I mean, it's no wonder we never celebrated it together. You know. Just me, you, and Dad." "What are you talking about, Brandon?" I asked in a soft tone. I didn't know where this was going, so I avoided being too confrontational. Plus, I knew what Brandon was capable of. A scowl overtook Brandon's smile. "All those years, he never hurt you. You never knew the things he did. The shit he did to me." For a moment, I thought tears were gonna flow from Brandon's eyes, but they never did. Instead, his harsh glare remained in place. Then I realized Brandon no longer had the emotional capabilities to even shed a single tear. God knows he'd forgotten how to give a hug. Teardrops had become as foreign as affection to him. Like Sam had ultimately made Brandon in his image, a soulless being. Like a bitter royal, Brandon sat back in his seat. "You just let him do those things to me. You didn't care." "Brandon, I'm sorry, but I couldn't do anything." I pleaded. "I couldn't stop him." "That's bullshit." Concerned, I looked over at my daughter. She'd stopped eating. Always a sign she was scared. And just stared at me with frightened, wide eyes. And unlike Brandon, she was on the verge of tears. I grabbed her shoulder in a soothing grip. "It's okay, sweetie," I said, doing my best to disguise my fear. Brandon slammed his fist on the table. The sheer force rattled all the dishes like an earthquake had struck. "No, it's not," he yelled. Helpless, and began to cry. I wrapped my arm around her and kissed her forehead. "It's okay." With irate energy, Brandon pointed at Ann. "You want to know what your mama did, huh?" "Brandon, stop it," I yelled. Like a psychotic preacher, Brandon leaned in even closer. He was less than a foot away from us. And oh so close to Ann. "She let our father fuck me," Brandon yelled. Horrified, I gripped my arms tighter around my precious Ann. "Oh God," I said in anguish. Brandon cackled. Not a joyous chuckle, but a guttural laugh from a jaded and cynical soul. "Yeah, that's fucking right. She didn't try to stop him either. He hit the table many times in furious succession. She let him fucking rape me. He screamed. Stop it, Brandon. I pleaded. She didn't give a shit about me. Brandon went on. There was no tears or cathartic release for him. Just this brutal rant. Sweat drenched his face, his glowering eyes sliced us like colorful blades. She let him rape me every night. Every fucking night. I couldn't do anything. I yelled at Brandon. I couldn't fight him. I too couldn't keep the teardrops from sliding down my face. Bullshit. Brandon hurled back at me. Behind the tears, I glared at him. I couldn't, Brandon. You know that. I was too young. I didn't know what to do. Full of rage, Brandon slapped the table once more. I felt the hit shake the entire table. I thought he'd even broken it. One more hit and he surely would have. No! Brandon shouted. You killed me. No, I said. Brandon, please. You killed everything I had. Brandon went on. He snatched the knife off his plate. Now I'm gonna do to you what you did to me. Terrified, I watched Brandon stand up. Put that down, Brandon. I yelled. Brandon, please. Brandon pointed the knife at us. I'm taking her away. He marked end with the sharp blade. Just like I got Daddy. I heard Anne's terrified cries. They were shrill and helpless. No sound a parent would ever want to hear. Acting on motherly instinct, I cradled Anne against me. No! I yelled at Brandon. God damn it, listen to me, Brandon. We didn't do anything to you. In a vicious taunt, Brandon waved the knife back and forth. But you didn't do enough, sis. He pointed the weapon at Anne. My daughter's tormented screams ravaged my soul. They were a torturous soundtrack. Now I'm gonna kill her like I killed Dad. Brandon continued. I'm gonna slaughter her like a goddamn turkey. Brandon I started. Brandon's horrifying war cry interrupted me. Like a mad killer, like the boy everyone found in Sam's kitchen over 20 years ago, he raised the knife and came charging toward us. Acting fast, I pushed the table forward. The wooden edge battered Brandon in the balls. Yelling, he cringed in pain and staggered back. Stay right here, baby, I commanded Anne. I kissed her on her pretty head before grabbing my plate and rushing toward Brandon. Holding his crotch, Brandon glared at me. Before he could raise the knife, I smashed the plate over his head. Brandon fell back against the wall. The knife slipped from his grasp. Fuck, he yelled. Disoriented, he hit the floor. Gravy from the plate covered his face like makeup. I picked up the knife. What are you gonna do, huh? Brandon hurled at me. He sat up, his intense eyes focused on me. You gonna kill me? You've already done that, sis. Breathing heavily, I looked over at Anne. She had her eyes closed and her hands over her ears, shielding herself from the horrors before her. Much like I did at her age when I buried my horror in those cartoons. Victoria! Brandon cried out with wild rage. Turning, I saw him lunge up and run toward me. His movements were fueled by uncontrollable anger. Like a reflex, I raised the knife, sinking the blade straight into my brother's heart. The final time I'd ever hurt him. Brandon collapsed in my arms. Like hot water, I could feel his warm blood pouring over my hands and clothes. But I still held on to him for dear life. Behind dying eyes, Brandon faced me. Redness seeped from his mouth, blood redder than our hair. He never once shed a tear, even while I wept before him. "I'm sorry, Brandon," I said with sympathetic softness. Brandon's blank expression never changed. "Happy Thanksgiving, sis," he struggled to say. "Enjoy the turkey." He flashed me a quick smile. Comforting Brandon in his last moments, I returned a weak smile. The least I could do considering he was my older brother. The same brother who'd taken care of me all those years. I watched Brandon die in my arms. His bright eyes remained forever open. His mouth is still agape, but his body was completely still. Still crying, I gave him one final kiss on the forehead. Then I laid him out on the dining room floor. Like my past, my clothes and skin were drenched in my brother's blood. Morose, I looked down at Brandon's corpse. "Mommy," I heard him say to me in a timid voice. I looked over to see Ann standing right beside me. Her tear-filled eyes stared up at me. She looked as helpless as I did that Thanksgiving Sam was killed. The day my family was forever torn apart. "I love you, sweetie," I told Ann. With a firm touch, I hugged her close. "I love you." The swinging doors burst open with ferocity. "Victoria," a voice yelled at me. Startled, me and Ann saw Randy stagger in. He was no longer my classy, handsome husband. Instead, he had cuts and bruises all over him. His breaths were heavy, his steps weak. Blood doused his dark hair and leaked down his face. "Oh my God, Randy!" I yelled. Clinging to Ann's hand, I ran over and helped Randy lean against the table. I saw pieces of duct tape still stuck to his wrists. Spots where he'd been bound and gagged. "What happened?" "What's wrong, Daddy?" Ann said through tears. "It's your brother," Randy said to me between breaths. "He attacked me." "Oh God." Horrified, I looked back at Brandon's corpse. "I got a phone call," Randy went on. He grabbed my shoulder, making me face him. "Listen, the hospital called. They said he broke out." "No," I said in terror. In my mind, I realized that had to be the number. The one that left me the voicemail. "They were trying to warn us," Randy continued. "They got cops everywhere looking for him." I snatched my husband's arm. "Where's Lee?" I demanded. "I don't know," Randy replied. "What do you mean?" Nervous, Randy's eyes scanned the room. In desperate search of our son. He took him from me, then he threw me in the trunk. "What?" "No." I grabbed Randy by the shoulders. Even hearing Ann's agonizing screams and sobs, I kept my focus on Randy. My panicked focus. "What happened? Where is he, Randy?" "Your brother took him. He took him somewhere." "Where?" With the desperate despair of a helpless mother, I let go of Randy and looked all around the dining room. I didn't see him. He didn't have him. Randy looked toward the table. I didn't hear another word from him. Aside from Ann's crying, I heard nothing. As if all life had left the dining room. Facing Randy, I saw his horrified eyes looking on at the table. "Randy." But he said nothing. I realized his face was now a disturbing shade of white. His mouth quivered, but nothing came out. Tears poured from his eyes. Gallons of them. I followed his petrified gaze. And I saw what had disturbed my husband. I saw what would forever haunt me. The turkey now leaked blood. More blood than such a bird could ever hold. Like blood seeping through the bottom of the door, the crimson all poured out in droves beneath the turkey. In an endless red stream. Tears fell from my eyes. "No," I said. I grabbed and pulled her in close. I had to guard her, especially since she was the only child I had left. "Enjoy the turkey." My brother's final words were more than an attempt at dark humor. They described the terrifying memento he'd left behind, the fulfillment of his twisted legacy. I realized his revenge was never about killing me or Anne. He wanted his flower's doppelganger, the older brother, Lee. With the turkey now half-eaten, I saw it for what it was, a thoroughly cooked human torso. The torso of a young child. My son. Not even the gravy could hide the soft, fleshy skin at this point. Not to mention the scattered bits of red hair masquerading as seasoning. Why I no longer celebrate Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Or at least it would be. After all, I don't celebrate Thanksgiving anymore. On this day of festivity and cheer, leading directly to the holiday season, you must find it difficult to believe that any American individual could truly find the day unfavorable. I mean, what kind of absolute grump would fault a day of giving thanks and eating merrily? Me. And I have damn good reason to, as well. Don't get me wrong, the day itself isn't necessarily contemptible by default. Honestly, the concept of Thanksgiving is a great one, and for most families throughout the United States, I'm sure that it's executed well. For me, though, it stands as a reminder of that horrific dinner that my family and I were subjected to last year. Well, unless I tell this little yarn, I suppose that no matter what I say about the holiday from henceforth will be automatically discarded as ridiculous, unpatriotic garbage. Once again, I must reiterate that I am a proud American, and the only reason I find Thanksgiving the way I do is because of personal experience. With all of that said, let's begin. Last year, on this day, my lifelong friend Thomas invited me to his home for Thanksgiving. Now, being a time for familial gathering and all, I found this gesture sweet but kindly refused in favor of enjoying the holiday with my family instead. It would appear selfish to my family if I left them to spend the whole day with Thomas. After all, I'm a happily married man with 2 kids. I couldn't just leave them on Thanksgiving, even if it was for a good buddy. The thing about Thomas, however, is that he's entirely and completely alone. The guy never got married, never had kids, nothing. Thomas lived entirely on his own, inhabiting a small, shaggy apartment a few miles away from my place in the lovely suburbs. Well, he did have a roommate, but his life was essentially comprised of work. Thomas once told me that he must have seen his distant family from another state more often than he had seen his roommate once he moved in. So anyway, when Thomas texted me, asking me to come over to his apartment and join him for some kind of activity, I texted back that I couldn't. It was hours later, right as I was about to carve the turkey, that Thomas responded. I felt the phone buzz in my pocket almost simultaneously as I was cutting into the prepared turkey. I quickly carved the turkey into more delectable slices and handed them out to my wife and 2 daughters. Then, I took out my phone and read the message that Thomas had sent. He had said that, if I wanted, I could bring over my whole family after we were finished eating and he would treat us all to a movie or something. I found this only slightly odd, as Thomas seemed uncharacteristically pushy, but shrugged it off and texted back that we would be at his place in less than an hour. True to my word, we scarfed down our Thanksgiving dinner, wrapped ourselves up in our winter clothing, and jumped into the car to head down to Thomas's apartment. When we arrived, Tracy, my younger daughter, astutely observed that Thomas's vehicle wasn't parked near his front door. We headed up to the door and knocked, and, miraculously, Thomas's hermit of a roommate, Lawrence, opened the door for us. He glanced over us as if looking at some donuts on display at a bakery, looked back into the apartment, and told us that Thomas had gone out to get some snacks for us to sneak into the movies. For a few moments, we just stood silently on the front mat as Lawrence shifted back and forth in the doorframe, clearly uncomfortable. After a good 15 seconds, Lawrence opened the door wider and invited us in to wait for Thomas. As usual, the main room of the apartment was in an absolute shambles. Dirty clothes littered the floor that surrounded the seedy couch, and the television had visible cracks along the edges of the screen. Most of that mess was likely due to Thomas. My family and I wearily sat down on the worn couch as Lawrence scuttled into the kitchen nearby, if you could call it that. After a few minutes, Lawrence came back out and told us that Thomas had texted him and asked to drop us off at the movie theater. Initially, I attempted to politely refuse, claiming that we were perfectly capable of driving ourselves to the theater to meet Thomas there. Lawrence kept insisting that he was just doing what Thomas had told him to do, and even showed us the text, though, so I just decided to go along with it. Thomas was probably just planning on driving us back from the movies to save on gas. When Thomas said something was his treat, he meant it all the way. And so, in a few minutes, I was in the passenger seat of Lawrence's dirty pickup truck with my kids and wife in the back. Right as we were pulling into the theater parking lot, however, Lawrence's phone dinged. The message was from Thomas. Lawrence showed me and read the message aloud. Thomas had told Lawrence in a rather vague way that plans had changed and that he now wanted Lawrence to bring us to his second family. For the first time since he had opened the apartment door, Lawrence gave us an excited grin and quickly reversed the pickup truck, eagerly getting us back onto the main roads. As I began to ask questions regarding this second family, Lawrence swerved onto a road I had never used before. From what I could gather, Lawrence and Thomas referred to a very close friend group that they had associated with in the last year as their second family, and that they had all been looking forward to sharing their first Thanksgiving. Now it appeared that Thomas wanted my family to join them for the dinner. Lawrence turned onto an isolated dirt road that led to a curious concrete structure in the backcountry. Lawrence parked the car near the front of the building, which looked so much like a mausoleum, and led us through the entrance. Inside, the building was comprised of many long, dark, intertwining halls that somebody could very easily get lost in. Luckily, Lawrence seemed to know where he was going quite well. He opened one of the doors in the left hallway, revealing a room filled with many other adult men and women. They sat at an almost comically long table lit solely by candles. Upon seeing Lawrence, they all excitedly stood up and praised him for bringing outsiders to the dinner, to which he responded they would need to start without Thomas, as he was running late on some errands. Feeling silly, intrusive, and most certainly confused at the term outsider, as well as at the rest of whatever the hell was going on, it took only a few seconds before I decidedly excused myself and my family. Lawrence looked distressed for a few moments after I had said that, and immediately began to protest, but the others swiftly quieted him, claiming they had no time to argue, as the dinner was close to beginning. Even as we walked out and closed the door, Lawrence looked oddly agitated. We wandered through the building's darkened corridors for the better part of an hour, waiting until Lawrence or Thomas came along to take us home, but it never happened. Eventually, we meandered back to the door where the dinner was being held to tell Lawrence we were ready to go home. Before we stepped inside, however, we noticed that the door had a strange symbol on it. One of the people inside had come outside undetected at some point and drawn on the door with some chalk because there was now a crude, cartoonish caricature of a turkey on the door. But something seemed wrong about the drawing. Ominously, it seemed to be more symbolic than playful. Rather than a cute or hilarious drawing of a turkey, the bird had been drawn with twisting, almost sadistic-looking feathers extending from its horrible, fleshy body. The head was drawn to look like a dagger-shaped protrusion of the disgusting neck. As I cautiously reached for the doorknob, my hand wavered. My family exchanged a few worrisome glances before I finally looked back to the door and turned the knob, opening the door. And they had all finished their Thanksgiving dinner. They had all finished eating a Thanksgiving dinner that was not made of turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce. When the police finally arrived, they looked just as disgusted as us at the sight of the mangled corpses. Pieces of them were strewn off of the bodies or just signed, eaten by one of the others or by themselves. Lawrence was one of the corpses, though we almost didn't recognize him. A few hours later, my traumatized family sat near me in the police station's main office. The police had also contacted Thomas, who now sat next to us as well, looking thoroughly perturbed and ill at the news. We weren't able to give much to the police, but surprisingly, they were able to tell us a lot. We had stumbled onto one of the many sects of the second family in America. For years, this had been a problem on Thanksgiving. While everyone was safely locked in their homes, enjoying a meal with the family, only the government and a few officials were aware of the widespread problem raging in long, unnoticed concrete structures that lay on the outskirts of many towns and cities. My family and I agreed to no longer observe the holiday without even exchanging words. We all knew that we wouldn't be able to enjoy it now that we knew this thing. But the worst part didn't occur until a few days after Thanksgiving. I had finally recuperated enough to put on my heavy winter jacket and drive down to Thomas's apartment. After arriving, I stepped out and slowly trudged my way up to the apartment door, facing down the whole time. I finally raised my reddened face to knock on the door. I stopped, freezing in that position. Right there, on the front door, written clearly in chalk, a demented turkey-like symbol greeted me. The mugwump that came to Thanksgiving. For starters, this story is much less whimsical than the title might lead you to believe. What is a mugwump? The answer is fuck if I know. Nor do I know where my aunt found one. My grandfather had always kind of spoiled Aunt Carol. She was the first girl born into the family and was a diva from day one. When my grandfather's cancer metastasized, it was like the martyr jackpot. She would call us at all hours of the day with some sob story about how poorly Dad was doing, and by implication, her. Meanwhile, the bulk of the actual care went to my Uncle Bob and Aunt Amy. Carol used her dying dad as an excuse to monopolize every conceivable holiday. When Grandpa passed, the sigh of relief from the whole family could have caused a typhoon. We had hoped this would be an end to the holiday shenanigans. Not. We were just in the doorway. My wife hadn't even gotten my youngest's coat off when Carol bustled over. "Oh, it's so good you're finally here." We were an hour early for dinner. I wanted to make sure seating wasn't a problem. I need to sit by Clarence, you know, he can't eat on his own. The name Clarence did not belong to any cousin I knew, and I could see from her face it was a baited hook to get me to ask who Clarence was. I ignored it and dealt with my kids before walking into the dining room and stopping short. What sat strapped to a booster seat was pink and fleshy and wet. It was the size of a toddler, completely hairless, with an oval opening for a mouth. Its bulging frog eyes had no visible whites. And not once did it stop wheezing through the whole night. "What the fuck is that?" I said, forgetting my rule against swearing in front of kids. Aunt Carol smiled smugly and fluffed the pillow behind it. "I found Clarence all alone. My poor little mugwump needs me. It's so nice to finally have something I can care for." Meanwhile, her adult son Kevin just looked downcast behind her. I'd never felt so much for the poor guy before. "What is that? Why is it at the table? My wife wouldn't let it go. I don't want it around my kids. It looks unsanitary." My aunt's smug expression didn't waver. "Clarence needs special care. He's a special boy," she cooed at the pink lump. I almost threw up right then and there. I don't even know how I made it to dinner. The thing about dysfunctional families is you get adjusted to weird shit quickly. Something fucked up is sprung on you, and you have a moment where you look at it and think this is normal now. So my aunt had a mugwump, and it was sitting at the dinner table. Carol hadn't done any of the cooking at the house. My cousin Kevin's much beleaguered girlfriend had done the side dishes, Aunt Amy had done the turkey. Carol's contribution was some shitty centerpieces she'd picked up at Dollar General. And the horrible, pink nightmare seated at the table, of course. No one was in the mood for dinner when all was said and done. It was an utter tragedy. We had a show-perfect golden brown turkey, my wife's patented bacon beans, and even my oldest daughter had baked a loaf of French bread. And we couldn't touch a bite of it because Carol decided Clarence had to be served first. She fetched the baby food mill and immediately began gouging pieces out of the turkey to put in there. She chose all the wrong bits, too, the crispy ones that resisted being ground up. All the time that damn thing was wheezing. It was like a dentist's drill in each ear. My eldest was pale. I gave her first glass of wine and told her it was okay. We tried to ignore the spectacle as we served plates, but the thing about Aunt Carol is that if you ignore her, she just gets louder. She talked about how the mugwump didn't have a bathroom hole, her words, not mine, and so she just put a diaper on for appearance's sake. She had to keep baby talking to it in a near shout as she shoved spoonful after spoonful of candied yams and stuffing bits down its oval maw. I don't know if that thing had a tongue or if it could even swallow. Half of whatever she put in it just slid out its mouth anyway. The skin at its neck kept bulging like a frog's. Aunt Amy made the mistake of looking over mid-chew and had to spit it out into her napkin. Uncle Bob, the oldest sibling, carved the turkey with murder in his eyes. When the mugwump took too much mashed potatoes and started choking, that was the point when my youngest daughter threw up. The stupid pink thing just started hacking, patches of the skin on its head pulsing in time with the coughs. My little Katie bent to the side and just unleashed a torrent from her stomach. In retrospect, I'm surprised it took that long for someone to toss it. After that, though, all bets were off. When Carol used her finger to fish a bacon bit off the mugwump's cheek and popped it in her mouth, Aunt Amy gave up and ran to the kitchen sink. Uncle Craig made it through 2 gut-churning dishes, but when Carol grabbed the giblets to put in the grinder, he darted outside. My oldest gave a wine-heavy burp. I hadn't been watching her, and she'd had 3 glasses. I used that excuse to get my family away from the table. My wife was close behind, desperately covering her mouth. The girls shared the toilet bowl. I spit a little into the sink but managed to regain my composure. My wife said fuck it and puked in the bathtub. I think she specifically aimed for the girly soaps Aunt Carol left in the corner of the tub. We all just took a moment to breathe and concoct our excuse to get away. Because when someone like Carol is acting like that, a rational explanation like you and your pink tumor child are disgusting isn't going to make an impact. When we made it back to the dining room, the only two people left in there were Aunt Carol and Kevin. Kevin was watching Carol coo over the food she was shoving into the thing's mouth with angry tears in his eyes. "This is why Dad divorced you, you know," he said. Carol didn't react. She gasped at how clever Clarence was when he made a noise very close to a burp. We had a war party in the kitchen. We were past disgust and had arrived at anger. Fuck that thing. Fuck Caroline, for that matter. We had to get her out of the house. But how? Kevin's girlfriend hit the $1 million idea. With coaching from all of us, she crept out to the dining room with a fake smile on her face. "Hey Carol, do you know where the whipped topping is? I've got 2 pumpkin pies ready to go out." Carol was incensed. She slammed the spoon down. "That's absurd. There's no way 2 pumpkin pies will last this whole family." Grumbling, she gathered her purse and ran out to the store. While she was gone, we took care of business. We got some towels to pick the mudwump up. No one wanted to touch it, and brought it to the backyard. That's when we found out that whatever a mudwump is, it's effectively immortal. Stomping on its head just led to it reinflating after a minute. Axes couldn't cut it. We even threw salt on it, to no avail. Finally, we just stuck it back in the house and burned it down. The house had been Grandpa's, but at this point every fond memory we had built there was gone. Aunt Amy stuck a towel on the burner and turned it up to high. We put the thing on the kitchen counter and left. Carol's highly efficient shopping ways meant that she didn't get back for almost 3 hours. The firemen had to restrain her from running in after Clarence. We had already told them that Carol was crazy and there were no children left in the house. I don't know what's worse, the fact that burning down my grandfather's house was the high point of the evening, or the fact that it was only the second worst Thanksgiving we'd ever had. My very worst Thanksgiving. Well, you've all heard the tale of my second worst Thanksgiving. To tell you the tale of my absolute worst, you'll need to know some things. First, Aunt Amy is Uncle Bob's wife. They were together for a long time before that, but they only just married recently. The reason why? My Aunt Carol. My Uncle Bob is the oldest child in their family. It goes Bob Carol, Uncle Craig, Uncle Tim, my mom. As such, he got held accountable for a lot more than the rest of the family. So when Bob went to his father saying he was going to ask for Amy's hand, Carol threw a fit. Why? Are you ready for this? Because, as the oldest girl, she had the right to marry first, out of all the siblings. And Grandpa went with it. My grandfather was a lovely man in many ways, but his single blind spot would be the mold spore that is his oldest daughter. Do you know why my mom wasn't present in the last story? She hates Carol with a fiery, molten hate and takes every opportunity to ditch holidays around her. So Grandpa vetoed the proposal. And Uncle Bob waited. And waited. I would have just said fuck it and go ahead with the marriage, but Bob was conditioned to accept his father's word as law. Finally, Carol married my cousin Kevin's father. You'd think that would be the end of it, but no. When Bob asked about money for the marriage, Carol always had some excuse. They were expanding the house, never did. They needed emergency medical funds. Kevin was covered under his father's policy. When Bob suggested a simple courthouse wedding, Carol lit into him about the indignity of depriving his father of a real, big, family wedding. Well, say this much for her, Aunt Amy stuck around. She's always been an aunt everywhere except on paper, and I love her dearly. We all do. So the worst Thanksgiving happened during my grandfather's last year of life. As I've said before, Bob and Amy had been doing most of grandfather's care while Carol mostly whined about how difficult it was. She had the nerve to try and ban Amy from Thanksgiving, seeing as they weren't married and Amy therefore wasn't really family. Uncle Bob retrieved his balls from storage and told her that Amy had been working harder in 1 year than Carol had in her entire life, and if she so much as mentioned this again, he would kick her out. She pouted, of course. It's what she does. But Bob thought that was all. I don't think I would have made that mistake. My mom came to this, her father's last Thanksgiving. My dad stayed home and pled the flu. He was just watching football, the lucky bastard. We all had fun saying hello to Aunt Amy, complimenting her on how hard she worked and how good the food smelled. You could practically see steam rise from Aunt Carol's scalp. She tried to steal attention by making loud, tragic announcements, such as, "I just realized this may be our last Thanksgiving as a big, tragic sniff family." We ignored her as best we could. I popped up to see my granddad. He'd been a big, broad man and the cancer had gutted him into a scarecrow. The light was gone from his eyes at this point. The machines were doing everything. I held his clammy hand in my own and tried to remember good times. Of course, Carol had to ruin it by bustling in, rearranging pillows, and asking Dad a bunch of rhetorical questions. I gave it about 5 minutes before I left trembling with anger. Come to find out later that it happened to everyone. Carol butted in on their private moments with her dying father to grasp for attention. None of us suspected she might have had an ulterior motive. Well, as you can see from my last post, Carol is not much of a cook. She thinks she is. She is not. The bitch could burn water. Aunt Amy, after months of dealing with her bullshit, had become an expert Carol wrangler. Carol could manage one dish. One. It could not be oven cooked, so she wouldn't interfere with the turkey, nor was she allowed to make a dish that someone was already bringing. Carol made a face but obeyed. Aunt Amy, give her credit, was at least a little more suspicious of her than Bob. But the whole day was a frenzy of cooking, and so she lost track of Carol. Carol was making some sort of individualized meat pie and confiscated the turkey giblets. Bob usually uses them to make mouth-watering gravy but lets them go for the greater good. She used Pillsbury biscuit dough for the crust. How did she make meat pies when she was banned from the oven? Our dear friend the microwave. It made the house smell like dog food, a smell that makes me anxious to this day. Uncle Tim was down from the Air Force that day. He kicked Carol out of the room so he could have personal time with the father he hadn't seen in years. After taking his time, Tim emerged with a disturbed look on his face and held a whisper conversation with Uncle Bob. It came out later that the surgery stitches on Grandpa's chest had been disturbed. They were bleeding and bruised like someone had reopened it and then drawn the suture back up too tightly. Bob figured Aunt Carol had messed with them for sympathy and filed it away for later, wanting to spare us the big screaming fight that would ensue. Ha ha ha. Spare us. Carol plopped a little individual pie down on every plate, not asking any of us if we even wanted one. My older girl Jill was just starting in her vegetarian kick and made a face. My little Katie almost shoved it in her mouth, but I took it away from her, thank God. True to form, Carol had to stop the whole dinner to make a long, self-indulgent toast. As you know, my father is reaching his last, wretched moments. Carol dabbed away a tear. Mom, who hadn't missed the possessive singular my, gripped her knife tightly. I want everyone to know that he was a great man. That he suffered so much but always provided for his family. The veins on Bob's neck were standing out. Aunt Amy was gripping his hand so tight her knuckles were white. That's why I've put on this dinner tonight. So that we might give thanks for my father giving us each, Uncle Bob broke. He pushed the chair back so hard it fell over. Shut up. Shut the hell up about giving. You don't know a single goddamn thing about giving. Your father is dying, and you're still taking from him. He pointed at her. Don't deny it. Cut this bullshit about giving, Carol. Carol was never one to realize when someone was angry with her. She drew herself up, indignant. That's exactly what I was doing, she said. I was making sure to give a piece of Dad to everyone. As one, we looked down at our meat pies. Oh dear God, Aunt Amy said. The ER is crowded on holidays. Family brawls, kitchen accidents, everything terrible under the surface comes bubbling out. Getting a doctor to look at Grandpa was a nightmare. While the uncles took him to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery, my mom and Aunt Amy took turns disposing of what we later confirmed to be pastries filled with my grandfather's tumorous flesh. For years ago, Thanksgiving killed my colleagues. It almost killed me too. I noticed it in small things. Foggy windows, a dead ladybug on the ground, and our milk kept spoiling. 2 men in black came in, ordered 4 coffees, and then left without taking them. When I asked where they were, my colleagues looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But it was when Kai twisted to me, his expression panicked, that was when I started noticing it. Kai was a newbie, and I was still trying to figure out why he'd chosen a coffee store as a job. You would think he'd pick a job at a library or somewhere less stressful. Kai was the epitome of stress itself, and just looking at him made me feel jittery like I wasn't doing enough with my hands. Do you guys smell gas? Kai said, eyes cartoon wide, and I shot him a glare. Announcing at the top of his lungs that he could smell gas really wasn't a good look for us. Kai was carrying a tray of donuts, and I could see each of them shaking along with him. Elena glided past him with a chuckle, sticking out her hand to stabilize the tray. 2 years older than the rest of us, the girl treated us like little kids. Kai, sweetie, she didn't even try to hide her patronizing tone. When the boss was put on business, Elena was our self-appointed leader, which meant she had full control of the Alexa, and we were subjected to hours of Olivia Rodrigo. Nobody is dying, okay? Calm down. Kai shook his head. No, but seriously, can you smell it? He sniffed the air. What is that? Elena rolled her eyes. Your imagination, she said, her tone hardening. I've checked, multiple times. There's no freaky gas smell. Another colleague, Casper, a broad-shouldered college football player, shoved him playfully. Originally from Australia, this guy's accent was too much on a Thursday morning. Casper had too much energy and was one hell of a control freak. I could sense his smile was a little too wide because we weren't all working at the speed of light. My colleague, however, was. Casper could make coffee with his eyes closed. Dude, chill. He grabbed a plastic cup and steamed milk, already preparing another with his other hand. There's no smell. 15 minutes later, I glimpsed the windows fogging up. The clock on the wall above the door didn't have a time. It had a date. December 21st, 12, strange. Still, though, I didn't think anything of it. Ever since starting as a barista, I have mastered the ability to delve inside my mind. I could blink and time would jump forward. I came to when my throat started to tickle. The windows were growing foggier, though it was a fairly warm day. Casper hadn't spoken in a while, silently making drink after drink, hot cocoa, and lattes, like he was being held at gunpoint. Kai was bouncing up and down in front of me, a manic energy around him that was starting to grate on me. This guy didn't know how to dress. His apron was backward, a mess of curls and wide eyes. I didn't blame him. The lunch rush was an introvert's nightmare. Caramel macchiato, Kai hissed out of breath, for, any day now. I snapped. Something pricked me, and I flinched slightly. I didn't realize I was digging the nib of my marker into my thumb. There was a tiny blot of red, blossoming blood growing in the center of my palm. After frowning at it for a moment, I licked it clean. Only for another blot to appear, this time larger. Ignoring it, I turned my attention to Kai when Casper snapped at me to focus. Jamie, quit daydreaming, all right? Orders, now. Got it, I said back, half sarcastically. Well, we have customers. Snap out of it. Kai jumped. He didn't like it when Casper yelled. I don't think anyone did. Something about his accent alleviated his voice. Kai flipped through his notebook, hands trembling. I glimpsed a sheen of sweat glittering on his forehead. He was shaking. And not the normal Kai freaking out shaking we had all come to know. The guy could barely hold his notebook. Thanksgiving, he said through a sharp breath. For table 2. What? His words confused me for a moment. I paused, scrawling the customer's name. I could feel the slick, wet feeling of something. I swiped my hands on my apron. What did you just say? Kai frowned. Latte, he said. The kid was dripping in sweat. For table 2. Maybe I misheard him. Kai was practically vibrating with anxiety. Wait, did I do something wrong? I shrugged, preparing the drink. Did you have a good Thanksgiving? Kai's brow furrowed. It was okay, I guess. He looked at me like I was the crazy one. Like I was the one blurting Thanksgiving for no reason. Leaning across the counter, he fixed me with a frown. Why? Thanksgiving was weeks ago. If he was playing some stupid prank, I wasn't engaging. Nodding, I dumped the drink on the counter for my frazzled colleague to collect. Kai grabbed it and shot me a relieved smile over his shoulder. I took a second to drink him in fully. He was running a fever, sweat pouring down his face and neck, strands of his dark curls glued to his forehead. He stumbled, catching himself with a laugh. Thanksgiving, Jamie. Huh? This time, my reaction startled a woman waiting in line. Kai turned back to me, still smiling. I said thanks. There it was again. Thanksgiving. With zero fucking context. He was freaking me out, and nothing scared me. This was slow, starting like a shiver down the spine and creeping into my gut. I could feel it paralyzing me to the spot, too scared to look at the boy. It wasn't just Kai himself who was scaring me. The way he was moving, pausing, and restarting like I was playing a video game. Maybe I was tired. I swiped at my eyes, and he was right in front of my face. Thanksgiving? I shook my head, my own words slurring. Kai had drawn a smile on his cheek. Why do you keep saying that? Saying what? Kai surprised me with a laugh. I said, "Can I go get milk from the storeroom?" Was Kai crying? Oh, right. I was sweating, my face hot to the touch. Yeah. Sure. I kept working, swiping at my clammy forehead. I could no longer see out of the windows. The store was quickly filling up, and customers screaming their orders at us. I did as I was told, taking orders and making drinks. But at some point, something started to twist in the air. Jamie, Casper poured steaming milk over himself, unblinking. He didn't even blink. That milk was at boiling temperature. I could see his skin bubbling. My colleague didn't react, pouring what was left of the steamed milk into a bottle cap. Can you hurry up? We've got customers to Thanksgiving. We need teamwork, people. I didn't watch him claw at a lumpy, melted piece of his cheek. But I did see him fling it on the floor. I made coffee, my head growing lighter, my thoughts starting to grow thick and heavy. I need to get out. But I couldn't move. Every time I tried, Casper was doing something progressively more insane. I turned to him after the milk incident, and he was chugging chocolate syrup. Then he did a clumsy cartwheel, landing on his head. Still, though, my body worked like a robot. I couldn't fucking stop. More orders were carried out, and our customers stopped looking like people. They were animals, throwing themselves at us, starving hands reaching for the coffee. Their words started to tangle into nonsensical screaming, and then Thanksgiving. I was preparing a coffee I didn't remember, my own hand shaking, when a man jammed his iPhone into his right ear. I didn't know what the order was, and I was just pouring hot water. I was half aware it was splashing onto the floor, soaking my shoes. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the man. He was still smiling at me, awaiting his cocoa, streaks of red seeping down his neck. There was something pulpy, a mass of fleshy red, dripping from his ear. Something snapped inside of me, but my body wouldn't stop. I plunked down a drink when the woman awaiting her latte plunged her fingers into her own eyes, lips splitting into a manic grin. With blood-stained fingers, she grasped the styrofoam cup and poured it over her head. I stumbled back, straight into Casper, whose mouth was moving. But I couldn't hear him. My head spun. I blinked. Casper was in front of me, screaming in my face, his fingers tangled with the glistening, pulpy mass of his vocal cords. His apron was splattered red. I didn't see the knife in his hand. He grabbed me, his lips stretching into a wide grin. I couldn't tell what he was saying, or trying to say, choking through mutilated lips. Thanksgiving. Casper was mouthing, along with the sudden laughing, screeching horde flattening each other, tearing at their faces, clawing their flesh from bone. It was both horrific and beautiful in my vastly deteriorating mind. I felt it like a virus leaching into my meat, bugs carving their tiny, skittering legs into my skull. Suddenly, my colleague waterboarding himself with milk was funny. Casper dove onto the counter, and I watched him, my vision blurring in and out of clarity. There was a man in a hat outside the window. I blinked. Casper somersaulted into the crowd, whose words were hitting me in waves. Elena was stumbling behind me, pulling out her intestines and tangling them on her fingers. I didn't even see her guts hanging out. I didn't see her slice into her stomach. I just saw her, a confusing blur of gore, spiraling. Spitting blood, she giggled, doing a pirouette. Elena was a great dancer. I found myself gleefully clapping my hands. Asterisk Thanksgiving. Elena slipped in pooling red, joining hands with Casper. Thanksgiving. My trembling fingers crept toward the silverware drawer, skimming over silver blades blurring into one. Thanksgiving. I dragged the blade across my cheek and then into my mouth, hysterical giggles escaping in a fountain of red. I pulled out my teeth one by one, sinking into the word, reveling in Thanksgiving. Slipping to my knees, I found Kai already on the floor, sobbing into his knees. He was chewing into them, spitting out globules of fat. When he lifted his head, Kai coughed up his ear. Thanksgiving, he spluttered in a giggle. I nodded, and we high-fived. Thanksgiving. One thought, heavily delayed, suddenly entered my mind. Oh yeah, I could smell gas. That was fucking strong. Around half an hour later, I was still screaming Thanksgiving in the back of an ambulance. Elena and Casper were dead, and Kai was clinging on. Somehow. For Thanksgivings ago, I almost lost my mind. I will never, ever celebrate that fucking holiday again.